The war in Ukraine has changed the world. And now we need to think about where this world is moving to, together. That's why MIM Business School is launching the nationwide educational project Reinforce UA, where the world's greatest minds will share their ideas and insights. And you will get their experience, change your perspective, and discover what changes should the business be ready for, before and after the victory. Every week on reinforceua.com.
That's now in English, not so long. Good evening, colleagues, friends. I'm Vyacheslav Pokatillo, and on behalf of MIM Kyiv Business School, welcome you on Reinforce UA project. The project we started last year, and there were 34 different lecturers, world-renowned intellectual, who shared their view about how the world in the future would look like. And we shall speak today about the future as well, because today our guest is Marina Gorbis, is the executive director of Institute for the Future, a 50 years old nonprofit research and consulting organization based on Silicon Valley. This organization was built actually somehow on a spin-off of a well-known RAND corporation, and is concentrated on future on investigation of the future trends and future challenges the humanity will face. Marina's current research focus on transition of the world work, a new form of value creation. She launched the Workable Future Initiative at IFTF. It's an abbreviation of Institute for the Future, and with the aim of developing a deeper understanding of the new work pattern and to prototype a generation of positive platform for work. Today, we could learn from Marina on how to think like a futurist. I'm still don't have Marina on the screen, and hope, oh yes, she appeared. She appeared. Here. Thank you very much. Okay, hello Marina. Nice meeting and seeing you again, and thank you very much for being able to join us. I remind that we actually should have this event on the 6th of October on our Forum the Future event, but because of technical issues, Marina couldn't connect to Kyiv. Sometimes it happens with internet connection still, but the future obviously will be different, and we are eager to listen and to understand what would you advise and how would you recommend us to think about the future, which is not easy in the current time, and not only in Ukraine. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vyacheslav. And thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to speak with you. As Vyacheslav said, the Institute for the Future has been around since 1968. So we're actually 55 years old. And I've been at the Institute for 25 years. So a lot of my professional life I spent learning techniques for thinking about the future. So what I want to do today is not so much tell you what the world is going to look like or what trends are out there, but mostly about how do you think as a futurist? What are some of the tools? What are some of the methodologies that we have learned in the last 55 years? And it's particularly, I think, appropriate. We see a lot of interest in futures thinking and the futures work right now, because it seems like every day today, almost, we wake up and something unthinkable is happening or has happened. You know, we've had a pandemic that the like of which we have not seen in 100 years. We have a war in the middle of Europe, which to many people was really unthinkable. We have a candidate for president in the United States right now who has almost 80 indictments against him, and who spends a lot of time in court, as you probably are seeing, which also seems to be unthinkable. And some people, if you read Nassim Taleb and his book, he calls it black swan events. So black swan events, in his interpretation, are these unthinkable unforeseen events that have huge consequences. And I kind of don't see these as black swan events. I'm not a big believer in those because, in many ways, you could not predict, you could not see the exact timing or the exact form that these events would take, but you could certainly see things moving in that direction. You could see that these things are very likely, and you could probably see them decades ago. They're events that are decades in the making. So in 2008, the Institute actually published a scenario of a large-scale respiratory pandemic called ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. And it wasn't that, and we really looked at what is the reactions of people, how will people cope, what strategy will they use, what will be the impact, who will be mostly impacted. And we saw a lot of these possibilities that we saw in real life almost 10 decades late, a decade later. And it isn't that we were so prescient, right? It wasn't that we had some crystal ball or we were so great about predictions that we saw this. But actually, if you talk to experts and if you look at the data, it was kind of inevitable. If you talk to epidemiologists and if you talk to development people and economists, we could see that people are increasingly moving into areas where they're intersecting and interacting with wildlife. And transmission of these kind of various viruses and diseases is more and more likely. So actually, you could really foresee that the possibility of a major pandemic is much more likely. We just didn't know exactly when or how or where it's going to originate, but that possibility. So I don't think of it as a black swan event. I'm sure that people in Ukraine and other places foresaw the possibility of hostilities with Russia, probably, especially since the occupation of Crimea. Again, this kind of event that seems like a black swan event, but very likely. Similarly, in the US, we probably saw increasing polarization in the population and the rise of populism starting probably in the 80s, 1980s, increasing in the 90s. So it's something that's kind of a rolling wave that appears, that hits our shores, but it's like it's foreseeable. So what if we can kind of see these events, not particular events, but these trends and directions coming, why do we not react? You know, in California, we actually got rid of a lot of necessary equipment and medicines that would be helpful during the pandemic, right before the pandemic started. So what is it that prevents people from reacting and preparing given understanding of these trends and possibilities? But what we know from work from neuroscience is thinking about the future and actually reacting to it is actually kind of goes against the grain of how we think and how we operate. There is neuroscience research that shows that when you ask people to imagine the world or imagine themselves 10 years from now, 10 years into the future, the same part of your brain lights up as when you encounter a stranger. So our future selves are kind of strangers to us. It's not something that we can empathize with. It's difficult. So some of the things that the Institute is working on is helping these future possibilities more tangible, more embodied, more real through development of scenarios, storytelling, visual films, and other kinds of things to really embody, to have people play them out and make them more real. You know, I wrote in my book that we're all immigrants to the future. We're all strangers in this land, and we need to learn new ways of being, new ways of understanding, new language, if you think, just like immigrants who move into other countries have to learn new norms, new cultural norms, new ways of new languages and other kinds of things. So what I want to share with you, the Institute, as I said, the Institute has been around for 55 years. And one of the first things we learned is that, as I said, nobody can predict the future. The purpose of future thinking is not to predict specific events. It's to look at these larger patterns and larger trends and help people make better decisions today. Because the kind of realities we're living in right now, the seeds of it were probably generated decades ago. We're living in that kind of somebody else's future based on those choices and decisions that were made decades ago. So really the purpose of what we do and the purpose of future thinking and foresight is really to to understand the future trends and possibilities and directions in order to help people make better choices and decisions today. So what I want to share you is some of the kind of basic techniques we use in our own work, in how we think about the future and how we develop our forecasts. So number one, when we start looking at the domain, any kind of domain, for example, future of work, a future of artificial intelligence, we start with understanding history. I always tell people that I'm as much a futurist as I'm a historian. We need to understand, Mark Twain famously said, the future doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. There are patterns in history that we need to understand that repeat themselves over and over again. There's these large-scale patterns. I don't know if any of you have seen Peter Turchin's book, who happened to have been born in Russia, but is a complexity theorist. And he has a new book called End of Times. And he developed this discipline called clear dynamics, which looks at sort of big patterns in our history. And he identified these periods of unity and disunity within every state, within every society. And what he talks about, what causes these periods of disunity is overproduction of elites. So in his view, elites are people who have more power, more money, more resources, because this overproduction of elites creates competition for power and for political power and economic power and other. So that's one factor. And the other factor is immiseration of the masses. So many, many people sort of losing livelihoods and being in dire straits. And those two conditions are preconditions for sort of increased disunity, which is very applicable to what's happening in the US, for example. Similarly, historically, now there's so much excitement about artificial intelligence and how it's going to change everything. It's going to permeate every aspect of our lives. And people are forgetting that this is not the first time where a foundational technology has entered our lives. And similar to, in some ways, to the Gutenberg press, for example. And it's really impactful to look at what happens when we change our basic communication technologies, like the Gutenberg press, which, by the way, caused many wars, 30-year wars, and a lot of discontent and a lot of political upheavals, because when we change our foundational communications technology, we change who has the power of voice, who has the power to speak, and where it is. So again, there's a lot of history of technologies that is really helpful in understanding this generation of technologies that we need to be aware of. So starting with understanding history before you can understand and develop forecasts about the future is absolutely essential. So that's one piece of it. The other thing that we looked at, history is important, but when you look at the future, what we look at is what we call signals of change. So to us, signals of change are things that are happening around us today that are maybe on the margin, that have not reached the mainstream. They haven't diffused in terms of scale or scope, but they're important to be paying attention to. They're the kind of things that if you see them or you read about them, they cause you, for me, it's always, I stop and think, oh my gosh, why is this happening? What is going on here? It doesn't fit my current sort of framework or my current understanding of reality. It's something that keeps bugging me almost, like I keep thinking about it. Why? What is going on here? Just one example, 5 or 6 years ago, I was walking around here in Silicon Valley, and I saw all of a sudden on the main street, if you've been in your route to Silicon Valley, El Camino is a main street in Silicon Valley. And suddenly I saw all these vans and RVs and people living in them. And I only saw these kinds of things during festivals or special events. And now you see people actually living in these kinds of conditions. And I started digging into it and found out these people are kind of the new working poor. They're people who come to Silicon Valley, maybe they're driving Uber, or maybe some of them are actually adjunct lecturers at Stanford, some of them students. But this is a new phenomenon of people who are not able, they're gig workers, they're people who don't have formal employment, but increasingly they are living in these kinds of conditions, which actually started the whole area that we've developed around new forms of work and the impact on people and on labor and other kinds of things. So these are the kind of things that are kind of strike you, and it could be a piece of data that you're seeing. It could be an observation like the observation I had. It could be a new development. It could be a new technology that's being developed in the lab, but it hasn't reached the population. It hasn't reached consumers. It's just its early stages. And a lot of our work includes this kind of scanning at the horizon for these kinds of signals and really having a conversation about, is this a signal or is this noise? Is this important? Is this something that you pay attention to? And if you've been doing futures work for a while, you have a really good sense of how to identify these important signals. I think it's really important to build this kind of capacity in organizations for continuously scanning the environment and really looking for these kinds of signals. And then once you have this understanding of the signals, we'll look at what do these signals tell you in terms of larger trends, sort of larger stories that are important to be paying attention to as you look at the 5-10 year horizon and more. Usually we gather them under this umbrella of we call STEEP. So STEEP, STEEP, it's looking at the combination of trends. So S stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, and political trends. So when we look at any kind of domain, we start with understanding what is happening on the social side, what is happening in technology, how technologies might impact that domain. If you're a business, that's what you want to be looking at. If you're in policy arena, you want to be looking at these forces. What's changing in the economy? What's changing in the environment? What's changing in policy arena, in regulatory sector, in politics? So the social trends are things like demographics. You know, everybody's looking at demographic trends, which is very, very important. You know, for example, the trend that we're kind of at peak population in terms of numbers right now, and the population is likely to decline. That's an important trend to be paying attention to. You know, another example of an important demographic trend, so it's projected that by 2050, African population is going to double. So 1 out of every 4 people on this planet will be from Africa. And then the majority of that population is going to be young people. So young people from Africa is going to kind of dominate the youth population globally. as birth rates are tumbling in richer countries. And that's a really important demographic shift. Of course, you need to be paying attention to it, whether you're a university and you're thinking about your enrollment, or your business, and whether you're a business and thinking where the employees will come from, where you might need to start operating, where the markets are going to be opening up. On the technology side, of course, we're all now talking about artificial intelligence and the impact of that. But there are other technologies that are equally important. For example, the battery technologies, the neurotechnologies, and other sort of biological discoveries and scientific discoveries. In the economic arena, what we're focusing on is proliferation of informal forms of work, which has been very standard in many parts of the world, but have not been as much in Western countries, where most people worked in organizations in formal employment. And now we're seeing really explosion of gig work. The most desired occupation by young people in the US right now is being an influencer on TikTok or other social platforms. That's new. Those kind of occupations really didn't exist. Obviously, environmental things, we're looking at climate change, the rising temperature, and particularly what it means in terms of human relocation. Where are people going to be moving to? Where are people going to be migrating? What's the impact of that? And on the political side, obviously, we're seeing kind of threats to democratic society, democratic systems, probably all around the world, but in particular places also, so that are important. The rise of populism, that's really, really important. So those are kind of the trend sides. So you go history, signals of the future, larger trends and patterns. And ultimately, what you want to get is, what is the insights? What do I need to take away from that? What's important? If I understand these signals and trends, what's the importance for me? What do I need to stop doing? What do I need to be doing more? What do I need to start doing? What do I need to amplify? And for different groups, the insights of the same trends may be very, very different. So if I look at the demographic data that I just talked about in terms of rise of African population and doubling in size, and really large increase in young people coming from African continent, if you're a university, you may be thinking about where your students will be coming from. If you're a business, you may be thinking about, how do I enter that market, or how do I prepare for that? If you're in real estate in places where populations are declining, or if you're looking at new forms of work, for example, that are more informal kinds of work. If you're in real estate, you're thinking about office space, and what is that going to look like? Do we need to build as much office space? Or if we do, what kind of office space if people are working in very, very different ways? So as I said, this is a kind of a sequence going from these historical to trends to signal to ultimately insights about what's important for me and for my organization. And ultimately, the last step of it is actions. So when we do these forecasts, our kind of sweet spot, we like to look 10 years out. For many decades, the Institute has been coming out with 10-year forecasts, which is our 10-year view of big stories, big trends, and signals that will be shaping the next 10 years. And so we have a wealth, we're the only organization that has survived its own forecasts, which is really humbling, because we can look back at them and see, what did we get right, wrong, why, and kind of compare and help us really get better at what we're doing. But that 10-year horizon is also good, I think, time frame for us, because 10 years are far enough that you can see these trends sort of amplifying, and you can get some clarity on them. but they're not that far enough that you can't really forecast. Like, I think 50 years is really difficult. Sometimes we do 20 or 30 years, but the farther out you go, the harder it is to see these kinds of trends. So given that context of 10 years and more, then you can start going back and based on these insights to really identify actions that you need to be taking today and tomorrow, kind of short term, medium term, and maybe long term, to basically get you to a more desirable future. As I said, the purpose of doing this future work and the purpose of foresight is not to predict the future, but to help people make better choices, more informed choices, and better decisions. So the actions that people, and that's another important thing about futures work, is we firmly believe that the future is not preordained. It doesn't just happen. We have some agency in shaping a more desirable future. And that's why that last stage of actions, what do we do today and tomorrow to ultimately either prepare for the future that and the forecast that we've developed or you've developed or groups have developed, but also what is it that we can do to move the future? There's things that obviously are not in our control, but there are many other things that we do have agency over that we can direct in a more desirable direction. So the last stage is really about what do we need to do today to move things in a more desirable direction. And that actually, to me, when you are in the futures field, it can be really depressing because you can develop a lot of very dire scenarios, very negative scenarios. And that's one of the dangers of doing this work. And I don't think that we should avoid building those scenarios. I think that they're ultimately really essential to our work, not just to think about Pollyanna and positive scenarios, but also really think about sort of these negative possibilities and really sort of very unpleasant things that might happen in the future. But there is a kind of hopeful thing, and that's what keeps me in the field, that even the idea that there is a future is a hopeful statement. It's a hopeful idea. It does say that, yes, we believe that there is a future and there is some agency. We have some agency in shaping that future. And that's what keeps me in the field, and that's what gives me hope. So ultimately, it's also exercise in hope. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Marina. It was very exciting to hear. Always, when we think about the future, as you said, it's easy to be depressed, but at the same time, you advise not to be trapped by this depression. We have a good example just less than a month ago in the US, and that's Andreessen Horowitz, and one of the founders of Andreessen Horowitz, Mark Andreessen, published an interesting, they call it manifest, techno-optimist manifest. If you was able to read it, it is some kind of a super optimistic belief that technology will save and solve all our troubles. It is a bright future because what we need to do is just to grow and to use the technologies and to contribute, to invest in technology, etc., etc., etc. This is always nice to have such optimistic approach. But how you, as an expert in thinking of future, would comment. Hopefully you saw it, or at least there was an article in New York Times about this. Started the discussion, which is good. What is your reaction? How about from not only emotional but also from an expert on how this should be done, how it should be treated from others?
Yeah, unfortunately, I and the Institute been in Silicon Valley its whole time. So we're in the midst of this kind of ideology of techno-optimism, although I don't think it started that way. And I don't agree in the premise, first of all, that technology is the key driver of anything. I don't believe in. I think technology is one of the drivers, along with many, many other drivers. My belief, and I think this comes from a lot of research and before a lot of these technologies were even invented, is technologies do come with certain capabilities, right? Like communications technologies. We won't be able to have this meeting right now the way we're doing it if we didn't have the kind of technologies that enable them. But that's just one piece. So technologies do come with affordances, but we shape technologies, our cultural norms, our social norms, how we allocate capital, our regulatory environment, our policies, all of these things shape how these technologies are ultimately implemented. For example, if these technologies were developed as public infrastructure, right? If they were not private technologies, if they were developed by governments, if they were in the public domain, the impacts would be very, very different than if it's technologies that are built by private companies and are privatized and basically eat all of our data. There's regulations that we can put on the use of these technologies, including privacy regulations, all kinds of moderation and other kinds of things. So I do believe technology is just one of the factors, and these affordances are important, but ultimately it's the larger milieu, larger ecosystem in which technologies exist that shapes their ultimate ramifications and their impacts. And I think, people in Silicon Valley, unfortunately, particularly technologies, most of them are techno-optimists because, as you know, if you're a fish, everything looks like water to you, right? If you're in technology development, everything looks like technology is the most powerful thing. But I don't believe that. And history of technologies, I just did an interview with Daron Acemoglu, who is at MIT, who's been studying history of technologies. And he talks about how important it is to be looking at these social, regulatory, and many other aspects of the larger sort of ecosystem.
Thank you. You mentioned that if you are a fish, you see only the water. But in this respect, I would rather remind the saying of the very well-known person, Abraham Maslow, who's his pyramid has been taught in all the business school worldwide. He said that if you have a hammer, then all the problems are nails. And it looks like in Silicon Valley, they have hammer, and all the problems should be solved by these modern communication technologies, which is a danger, of course. But it comes, I see our participants became active, and I appreciate this very much. Thank you very much. I just switched to questions, but before that, I want to somehow to extend the same statement, because you mentioned power, private companies, and this example of this powerful private company with a certain optimism about our future, which not everybody likes. Comes the question about how to find a balance, coming to the last your point about action, how to find a balance and what we all businesses in particular should do in order not to to give too much power to a private company, which are not necessarily represent the let's say the unique right way to the future. Recently, we had a number of examples in Ukraine, in particular, how private companies can influence global situation. And these examples everybody knows, but what to do and how to approach them is not absolutely clear. What kind of actions or what kind of institutions, you said, agencies would help in this respect?
Well, I do think it's a primary role of government. You know, markets are really important, and I believe in market systems, and I think that they have their place and they're essential to functioning economies. But I also feel that markets operate, and Robert Reich, who used to be the labor secretary, had this article and I think a book called Saving Capitalism. And he argues that in order for capitalism to have positive impacts and to actually exist, it has to be within certain boundaries. And I do think that governments have a role to play in setting and sort of those boundaries and sort of establishing the balance between the different interests, whether it's business interest and interest of the people and average people, and creating these kinds of conditions in which markets operate and operate well, but also do not usurp excessive power. I think in many places, including the US, that balance has been disturbed. You know, the balance, there's a lot of influence and lobbying and money that goes into buying votes. And so that balance, we're trying to, you know, reestablish it, but it's not necessarily there. I think also, and some of the work that we've been doing on equitable enterprise, there are different forms of enterprise. You know, the drive, if you look even at German companies, the German companies have labor representatives on their boards. There's a lot of terms and conditions under which they operate. So if you look at even things like automation, Swedish workers are not worried about automation because they have a voice in how it's implemented. You know, I think German workers do not fear that as much. In the US, there's a huge fear of automation because it's going to displace so many workers, and there is really no sort of limits on and controls on that, or very few limits on that. So, and particularly this generation of technologies with AI, using a lot of creative work and creative outputs to create new things. So that's why you're seeing now strikes by writers and screen writers and actors and others, because we're seeing that it can potentially impact people very negatively. So I think that that's, to me, the main role of government, is to create this sense of balance between different interests.
So to rely on politicians also could be dangerous. We have a question from people who are participating online currently, and Yevhen Savelyev asked the question. I would a little bit to reformulate. You can see in Q&A as original formulated, but it's about you know, such issues like faith, spirit, beliefs, ideology. I would continue. How I would reformulate a little bit this question in the following way: how in this process on instrument of thinking about future, all these things, all these matters, ideologies, should be treated and taken into consideration, because we obviously have at the moment on the world, I could be mistaken, certain, you know, not a stable situation with what kind of dominating ideology will be. You mentioned that demography shows us that every fourth person should be black soon, but what every fourth person would believe in the future, and even in the terms of the 10 years, and how to approach to find any instruments and possibilities to think about this.
Yeah. I do think that I would put it under the kind of umbrella of culture and beliefs. And I think those are very, very important. I think, I'm kind of a recovering economist myself, but I think one of the failure of economics and economic approaches is that there is no way for economists to think about beliefs and cultures. There is no language for that. And they miss that. And Peter Drucker a long time ago said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I truly believe in that culture and beliefs is what ultimately shapes even what we consider normal, what kind of regulations are considered normal, what kind of policies are considered normal, what language and terms we use. So a lot of our work, we do look at culture and kind of cultural changes. The way we actually do it is we use a lot of ethnographic and anthropological research, where we go and we have observations and we have interviews. We talk to people and to understand what are their motivations, what are their beliefs. A lot of that comes from talking to younger people. If you want to look at shifts, right? If you want to look at changes in culture and beliefs, I think young people are good sort of harbingers of that, and they're good signals to be looking at. But you want to identify those changes in beliefs and ideologies. And I think it's absolutely critical in the future's work.
Thank you. From my standpoint, it is even optimistic with what you've said, because coming back to this Drucker's statement about culture, its strategy, for a lunch, as a professor in strategy, I'm not very happy about this, because my colleagues who teach other subjects, more softer, are happy. But it makes me optimistic, because it's easier to start doing something, because we can just experience and implement and do what we believe is right. Which means that empower us to shape the future. That's at least my understanding of how we can act, taking into consideration this big influence of ideology and culture, to act and to build a world which we would like to live in.
Yep.
You mentioned it. We are all immigrants in the future, but actually we should be immigrants who should create it also. We have Maxim Roganian among participants, who actually didn't ask the question, but he wrote a number of statements in the chat, which I would summarize in the following way: all predictions fail. All futurists actually told us mostly not correct. Told us not about the correct future. You mentioned that thinking of future is not making a forecast. But how would you also comment on this kind of statements? It is exaggeration, I understand, but a lot. Let's call it softer. A lot of predictions appeared or failed to be correct.
Maybe a lot of them have failed, but a lot of good forecasts, I would say, come true. I can go back to back to that. The question to ask yourself is not where the prediction failed, but really, did it help you make a better decision? Did it bring something up for you that made you rethink things, or that helped you kind of move in the right direction? So to me, it's not just because prediction failed, to me, doesn't mean that it didn't pick up a lot of things. When people talk about failed predictions, a lot of times it's very sort of specific things, like it didn't happen on that day, or it didn't happen in exactly the same way. But can you look at it from a different point of view and say, was a general trend and direction that was identified in that prediction the right one. Yes, and there are a lot of bad predictions. There are a lot of bad futurism out there. I can say that in the Institute, we go back, one of the founders of the Institute was Paul Barron, who developed packet switching technology, which is the foundational technology of the internet. There wouldn't be any internet if not for packet switching. He developed it when he was at RAND. And we went back to the papers that he wrote and brought to AT&T, and he talked about, this is 1960s, he talked about renting videos online, us communicating, doing video online, all of these things. And when he presented this to AT&T, the largest telecommunications company, they pretty much laughed him out of the office, right? So there are a lot of, it's possible, I don't know if he had a timeline for that, and it maybe happened later than people foresaw, but absolutely, when we look at some of the things we looked at and kind of developed forecasts around, I can go back and we stand by them, most of them. Sometimes you fail, of course, in some ways, nobody's perfect, but it's a tool, just like a strategy is a tool for decision making. Foresight is absolutely a tool for making better decisions and better choices. And the tools are always evolving. We're working with better tools. We're getting more data. We're becoming more sophisticated in doing that. But I would say that you cannot do strategy work. Every successful strategy is based on a good insight about the future. I don't see how you can do strategy without it. Otherwise, you're solving today's problems.
Yes. So addressing to Maxim, I would just add that it's even good that not all the forecasts become true, because there are plenty of forecasts which we don't like and happy when they fail. You mentioned during your presentation that sometimes even knowing trend, even identifying those issues which force us changing, we are reluctant, or let's say not always good in changes. Let's say the most recent, let's say, Hollywood movie also from California, but don't look up, like a little bit very bright and very stressful illustration of what could happen if we will not react on those realities, which we can't even predict. But currently we have a little bit minor, but a lot of the same things, and also on a micro level, the companies. What first would be appreciate if you would somehow comment why it happens, because you have a degree in psychology as well. What's behind? And another is what to do, first of all, about businesses, companies, in order to start acting, despite we cannot predict 100% that or other things will happen, but nevertheless we need to make decisions now. What would be your recommendations?
I just did another presentation where I talked about, now we've identified 200 cognitive biases that we all have. And that's not a bad thing, because it's basically heuristics. It simplifies our decision making. And absolutely, we need to have those, because otherwise we will never be able to make decisions and we'll be swamped with information and a decision. So they're very, very useful, but they're also not very useful in many other ways. And recognizing these biases is really important. One of these biases is a legacy bias, right? So you see that, but you have an institutional setup and you have legacy systems and legacy thinking that prevents you from actually changing. That's a very strong bias. There's a kind of a bias, in-group bias, where you see that everybody in your organization thinks the same. So it's hard to, particularly if the leader of the organization I would say, if the leader of the organization is truly interested in change and buys into kind of some of the foresights and understands and is willing to change, it's another bias, that the authority bias, right? That other people will follow that. But there's an in-group bias. So if you have a group of people that believes in certain things, it's really hard to move them. For each one of those biases, I think there are ways that we can remedy those biases. Some of the trainings that we do in with futures work is precisely that. So, the legacy system bias, you need to understand and make kind of the benefit and the incentive of something different higher than the cost of losing something, right? So there's these trade-offs that you need to be making. But yeah, I think that we're working against, as I said, when we think about the future, the same part of your brain lights up as when you're meeting a stranger, right? So it's this alien world for a lot of us. And so we have to work against our inherent biases and ways of thinking to really kind of take that information and act on it.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions. One is difficult. I would leave it at the end, but Elena asks about business education or education in general, because the question is about business education. In your institutes and all the trends and all the currently, in California especially, all the messages that, the standards education is no longer valid. There's all the grants to startups, give up learning and start doing business and create new technology. What's your opinion of your colleagues, and what you see, observe? What is the role of education, in particular business education, to be specific, and how it will help companies to make better decisions for the future?
Yeah, I think there are 2 kind of separate questions. One is education, one is business education.
Let's speak about business education.
Okay. There's been a lot of criticism of traditional business schools and business education on many grounds in the US, mainly because curriculum hasn't changed that much in decades. And also because we talked about humanities and doing like ethnographic research and other taking culture into account. Business schools are not, at least in the US, are not particularly good about integrating those subjects. I think a lot of US business schools, right, mainly you learn about how to create companies that deliver return to investors, right? So it's not taking into account many other social aspects of business. It also, in our Workable Enterprise Initiative, we've been looking at different forms of business, including cooperatives, including mutual benefit societies, including limited profit companies, and other that deliver not just economic returns, but also social returns. And none of those, there are very few business schools that teach those alternative forms of business that are more, I would say, looking beyond the economic returns, but create these other returns. Cooperatives probably have a bad name in Ukraine. But there is a kind of a revival of interest in co-ops, and many of them are being formed in California. But there's no place where students can teach that. So I think there is a kind of a rethinking of what business education is and what constitutes curriculum in business schools.
For me personally, it's a good word, and I fully agree that this kind of models of business, of organizing business, is how to call it, undervaluated currently, and can create a lot of possibilities for the future.
And
now
I
it
hope
comes
actually, yeah, and I actually hope that Ukraine, that you can not abandon those kinds of forms of business that are in many ways more democratic. There are problems with that. I was just reading a paper and somebody pointed out, the reason we haven't had more co-ops is because the transaction costs of democracy are high. And it's, oh, that's really interesting. Well, you can say the same. You can say about governments, right? Authoritarian governments are more efficient. Transaction costs of democracy are high. So,
well, it's become dangerous if you would speak in economic terms everything and discuss everything in economic terms. Let's somehow balance, because we have a lot of lot of how to call lot of other presidents to take the place, the head role, like technology, which you mentioned before. Now comes the hard question from Georgi Veremeychuk. I would also reformulate it. It's formulated in Ukrainian, but I reformulate it because he ends with the question or whether wars will change the trend. I would formulate the question in the following way. Currently, we have that wars are going on. That's the fact, actually. It's a reality. And there is a tension, or at least expectation that this is not the end. It will last. How instrumentally you use, what you would recommend to use, this kind of reality, wars, which is very difficult to let's say, to see in terms of 10 years, and how to make businesses in wars, during wars. We in Ukraine have our own experience currently, and how all this subject, I mean, wars and the future, would, let's say, please give us at least some help on how to approach this situation, if possible.
oh, that's a tough one. How
yes,
do you?
I know.
I would probably turn to you for advice and for, I can tell you how, and this is not the subject that we've tackled, we haven't really done forecasts around wars. And as I said, there's things that you can sort of forecast in terms of conflicts and other things, but I would probably want to bring a lot more expert on, there are all kinds of experts that talk about and have developed forecasts around this particular war, and in general, the kind of global sort of polarization that we're seeing. Yeah, it's, I would say, I would probably want to develop some scenarios of different possibilities and really engage experts in thinking through what some of the possibilities are of a long-term war, and not give you a flippant answer. This is what
well, okay, I understood, but there was a question I couldn't just avoid it. I would say that you mentioned that curriculum of business school is some kind of outdated, but probably not so outdated, because currently we should remember or recall the Clausewitz, and to understand how we should oppose those ideas that the wars are solutions, or as a politics which can be extended to such scope. If you still have a couple of minutes, I know that we are a little bit exceeding the time, but I'd like to ask some kind of a more human questions. Live in California, it's far away from us, and we know that there are all the businesses and all the modern and future technology are there, but there's still some people there living. And could you tell us how do you live? What are, let's say, your everyday, I don't know, I would say issues to solve, but what's your same family? Please tell a few words about yourself and your kind of living in such a nice place, at the same time not an easy place like California.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. You know, the weather is great and it's beautiful, just landscape. So a lot of outdoors and people are doing a lot of outdoors. It's California to me, and particularly Silicon Valley. It's like it is an example of the best and the worst. You know, it has beautiful climate. It has incredible sort of human potential. You know, we have people come here from everywhere around the world. You know, when I walk the street, I hear languages. I hear all languages. It's very, particularly around the university. I'm very close to Stanford. So there's a lot of that, but it's also epitome of the kind of economic inequalities that we're seeing. You've probably been reading about homelessness. I think there are parts of San Francisco right now where literally there, I haven't seen this kind of poverty. I probably in developing countries, but we literally have camps of people living with no housing. It doesn't have to be this way. It's a policy political choice, really. So it's in many ways kind of an enclave economy where people who have a lot of wealth and a lot of money live sort of in gated communities and never interact with that other side of it. And then we have extreme poverty, and particularly the kind of poverty that is inexcusable because it's all the people who are providing necessary services. So it's teachers, it's firemen, it's you know, we have doctors who can't afford to live here, who are moving out of the area because it's so expensive, and it's a place that attracts all the capital, right, from all over the world. So we see, you know, the really expensive part of San Francisco, almost 30% of those mansions are unoccupied. And who's invested in them? It's oligarchs from Russia, it's oligarchs from all over the world that are basically buying up assets that make a lot of the housing unavailable. So it's a really interesting place because it has the best and the worst. And we're constantly trying and struggling to create that kind of balance.
Thank you very much, Marina, for insightful presentation and for open answers. I appreciate and thank you also attendees and participants for your activity in asking questions. I tried to follow everything which you sent. And like just to remind you that the event Reinforce UA, although in a little bit our project a little bit in different form will continue. We shall meet monthly, once in a month, on the third Wednesday every month. And I'd like to remind you that third Wednesday would be next week, which means that we shall have in 1 week the next session on November 15th. It happens because today's session is actually as was moved, should happen before. Our guest will be Stepan Orešković. He's from Slovenia, and therefore I probably pronounce it correctly. And Stepan is president of the supervisory board of IEDC Bled Business School of Management, which is a partner of MIM Kyiv, and we have a lot of good friends there. But at the same time, he is a very successful entrepreneur, and we are looking forward to talk to him, to listen to him, and to talk to us questions about on the subject on how to create a winning business ecosystem. Ecosystem is a nice word, widely used. everybody wants to have ecosystem. Not everybody knows how to create it and what it is. So the next event would give a chance to everybody to learn more. With this, once again, thank you very much, Marina, for joining us. We appreciate it very much. Wish you a good weather in California, and just how to eliminate a little bit all this, let's say, some kind of contrasts. Because when you spoke, it reminded me that South Africa, in Cape Town, which means I believe that San Francisco will not look like Cape Town in the future. In the future, because it's a very nice and pleasant place to be, but at the same time, you obviously see all this contrast created by troubles. Everybody who joined us, thank you, and I'm looking forward to meeting, hearing, and learning from you in 1 week. With this, goodbye. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
The war in Ukraine has changed the world, and now we need to think about where this world is moving to, together. That's why MIM Business School is launching the nationwide educational project Reinforce UA, where the world's greatest minds will share their ideas and insights. And you will get their experience, change your perspective, and discover what changes should the business be ready for, before and after the victory. Every week on reinforceua.com.